Hi, Jarrell. How are you? We'll start in about a minute or two. Go ahead and check out the notes and the assignments in Canvas. Hope you're doing okay. Okay, you can find the notes in the assignment in Unit 7 module. Okay, thank you. All right, so I'll go ahead and get started. I think more people will join us shortly. So this week we are going to cover Chapter 7, which talks about scripting to work with FTP, SSH, and SFTP. And in each of the type of server, we're going to see different type of script, including how to connect, how to transfer file, and how to brute force those type of servers. So we'll take a look at those scripts. And so now we are going to look at Chapter 7. So in Chapter 7, it begins with talking about FTP, and FTP stands for File Transfer Protocol. Now, in the past, we have seen how to use other type of modules, but we will look at specific module that focuses on FTP this week. So FTP is a protocol that allows us to connect two systems via TCP port 21. And it is used to transfer data, either upload and download, but it is a clear text protocol, so it is not secure. It's the way that we can exchange files between the client and the server. Some FTP server, you will find that you need to create a login. Most of the FTP servers that you see now for file transfer is using SFTP, which is Secure File Transfer Protocol, which uses port 22, which is the same as SSH. However, in the normal FTP, if you see public FTP that doesn't use SFTP, it uses port 21. Now, the requirement to have an FTP communication is that the server needs to be available via the network or the internet. Some company, they will have their own FTP server to distribute files or to have the user exchange file or data with the actual server itself. The second part, that's a part of the requirement, is the client must have the capacity to send and receive. So we have to be able to accommodate that with network connection, whether they're using an internet-based FTP server or a network-based FTP server. Now, in this chapter, it talks about FTP lib, which is a module that's specifically created for FTP. You can use this module to connect to the servers from the client. You can also use it to execute commands on the server, because normally a client system would connect to the server to be able to maybe download files, view the directory, or access certain area of the server. And this module you can also use to create FTP clients. And when you do that, you would be able to set up the client to connect to the server. Like any other Python module, we need to be able to install. So you can install it in command line using pip3 install FTP lib. Okay. So now let's go to the assignment. We can address some of the questions from the assignment. So the first question is really simple. It asks you what port is used by the client to establish connection with the FTP server. We know that it uses TCP port 21. And so for the common port for FTP, it simply uses port 21. Now, in some of the script, you need to include, right? Sometime you want to look at port information, so you can include, your parameter to include port or IP. But a lot of the times we just use the URL or the endpoint URL for the FTP site. Now, before we do number 2, we are going to take a look at some of the example from the notes. So the first example shows you how to connect to the FTP server. And part of the module, it also includes a snippet, right? This is a snippet that you can pull from the documentation or even looking at the actual module itself. So we are going to import in FTP as a class, and that comes from our FTP lib, which is the library that we're using. We are going to use a with statement, and with this, it's going to be able to communicate with the site. So when you include the FTP site, it needs to go into the quotation mark, right? So we want to use the double or the single quotation mark. And it is part of this instance, so that will be the FTP. That's why we import that in here. So that means it's going to connect to this website using that protocol. And so when you do that, it actually already incorporates the specific port that was written for this under this class from the library. So we would use the with statement, and we would specify our parameter as the FTP site that we want to connect to. Now, in the next line, you would see that it would use a login, and we're not specifying any username or password. So that means that this particular site allows anonymous use. So someone can just access it anonymously instead of having a user account. So the login method here allows us to use the site as an anonymous login. If you have a website that requires specific accounts, you have to specify what the username is and what's the password in order to be able to submit that to the server as you are connecting to the server. Are you installing it on Tawny? Tawny will do that. I think you can run it fine on Tawny with the default Python library. But if you install this on your command prompt or your Linux machine, it should take it fine. Okay. Some IDE, it's specific to that, and then or if for Windows, sometimes you're gonna run into errors as well. Okay. I was able to execute the script fine without having to install it on Tawny, so it should work fine with your existing Python library. Okay. All right, the second method here is the dir, or it's going to allow us to list the directory of that server. Most of the FTP site that you see out there, they would organize the data in hierarchical structure where you would have folders or directories that would contain subfolders and then other and files underneath. Yeah, so you don't have to install it right now. I think you should be fine running it. I tested some of the example and it should be okay on the IDE. But if you do use your Linux virtual machine, right? So if you go to, let me click this and see if it's going to open here. If you go to their documentation, this is the documentation right here, right? It gives you some example of the script. And in the text, it tells you to install your packages or your module, but I was able to test it fine. So it should be okay with the Python library. Okay. Yeah. So we should be fine, but when you're using Debian or something like that, you can also install. So here is example 1, right? Simply this has 4 lines. Now the example is we are going to connect to this site. So as long as the site that is using FTP, not SFTP, you should be able to connect to it. So now on the IDE, just to go to your questions, right? If I wanted to go here and I would say FTP lib like this, right? It won't be able to find it because it's not gonna, they didn't create it as a PyPy, so you won't be able to find it. That's why when you issue that command, but according to the textbook, you should be able to install it. So that's what I put as a note. But I think you should be fine with just the Python library. So we talked about the code for this, right? And so if you run this, you would see that it would give you the files and folders within. So that is coming from the dir method right here. That will be equivalent to what you see in dir in Linux machine. And because the site support anonymous login, we didn't have to put in any credential. So it's able to provide this. Okay. Now your output is going to show the permissions, okay, of your directory content. So here you do see some of the directories that are listed and then the time stamp on it, and also the type of services that's used for and the permissions. So it's a quick way for us to really navigate through the site without having to access individual component. We'll be able to list the directories that's contained on that server. So in number 2, what we're going to do is we're going to refer to the first example to be able to write our script. Now for number 2, it tells you to use example 1, and you are going to use that as a template. You need to make sure that you incorporate FTP lib, and you want to connect to this site, ftp.be-debian.org. And we want to display the directory information like what we've seen in example 1, and we want to provide the screen capture. So you can use this as a template. Now you can also use your search engine to search for publicly available FTP site, right? But some require login, and so with that you have to give it a credential. But for the second exercise, let me see. So I simply have an import statement. I would have from FTP lib import FTP, and that's your superclass. And with this, we would be able to use the instance. So here we would have with FTP, and then you want to put the URL that the exercise asks for. So often that you don't need to use HTTP www. The FTP site, you would normally have the FTP extension. So you would have FTP dot, right, be.debian.org. So when you look at this URL or this domain, the parent domain is debian.org, and then your subsequent, you would have your subdomains listed underneath, and this is an FTP. So that's why you would have FTP in the front. So when you work with FTP site, you would often see that it would have FTP dot and then the domain itself. Okay. Now, when we look at the first example, right, they use FTP1 so it really depends on how they register that compared to what you see in the other side. So here I simply have a with statement, and I put in my parameter as the FTP domain, and then I would have as FTP, and I want it to log in and to give me the directory. So let me clear this, and I'm going to go ahead and run that. Okay. Now we want to use the with statement because it needs to iterate through all the directories on that site. Therefore, you want to use it so that way you list all the directory. It's very much like what you've seen in dir in Linux, where it looks at all the entire container and then all the components inside that container. So here it gives me the directory for the FTP site. And again, I would have permissions on the left and the details about the directory. So it tells me that the backsport.org, that's going to be the Debian backsports. And then underneath that, I would have various subdirectory and files. Okay. So this is a quick way for us to identify folders and files on an FTP site. And from an attacker standpoint, right, they'll be able to look at the permissions and the type of data that's contained on here. But for the protective measure, we also wanted to take a look at this and see how things are modified, things are maintained on the FTP site. And this is a public site, so you should be able to use it anonymously. Any question? And so for exercise 2, we only need to do about 4 lines. And in this exercise, we learn to use FTP-lib. And we create a connection to a certain FTP site, log in, and be able to list the directory. Should I get the same files as example 1? No, because it looks similar. So here is my example 1, okay? As you notice that I have this many from my exercise, okay? I'm gonna run example 1 for you. It actually has less. I do have a readme.mir, the devil, distribute or distrib, and historic. So they have different directories. So the second program that I run here, that's example 1. And then this is my exercise. So in my exercise, as you're using a different FTP site, you would have different content. Okay. So this is a quick way for us to find out what that FTP site contains as far as directory and files. Question? Yes, they are 2 different sites. Yeah, I'm using the debian.org, and they are both FTP sites. However, in the example, right, this is an FTP1, so this is different website. So all you have to do is replace your FTP site information with what is asked in example 2 or in exercise 2. Now, as we look further in example 2, this is a way that we can download files from FTP server, and you can write a script to do that, okay? So in example 2, it uses the ftp.be.debian.org. That's from like our exercise 2. But So you can plug it into the parameter, or you can use a variable to be able to store the URL, like what we've seen when we work with socket. So here we simply do an import FTP lib. We would specify what our server URL would be, and notice that we would use FTP dot at the beginning. That's an FTP site. But in order to download from the FTP server, we have to know the path. So it would be helpful to run example 1, so that way you would know all your directory and your files. Then from there, we can specify the download dir path here. This is going to be the path where you're going to download from. And that will be certain files in a certain folder. So you're going to make sure that you look at those folders and files first before you would proceed to download. It's very much like how we would navigate through the FTP site through the GUI, and we would click in certain areas. So it's simply just take you to a certain location on that server inside a certain folder. And we are going to download this file called changelog 5.0. Then in the second part of this program, we define a function. And this is a custom function, so we define FTP file download, and in its parameter, we want to use server and username. Now, in order to download as a client, you have to create a client. So here's your client object. And to make a client object, you simply give it an identifier, and then you would use FTP lib. That's the module that we're pulling a lot of the functionality from. And because we are using FTP, we are going to use the FTP instance. So here, that's going to bring in the server and the username. Okay. Then on the next line, we have a built-in method from FTP lib. It's called CDW, and it's exactly like that in Linux. It's change working directory. And so here we want to take the client machine and bring it to a certain folder by using a CDW. Okay. And we are going to plug in this path that we've previously defined. So you're going to put that in here. So basically, you're telling the system that it needs to navigate to that path to be able to download. Then in the next part, we're going to have a try. So again, we're going to use a with statement. We're going to have it open the file. Okay. And it's going to use the file handler. Then we are going to issue the command, and as you know that when we're accessing the server, right, we can tell it to download. So a lot of the time on the graphical user interface, you would have a download button. So when you click that button, the developer, they designed that button to execute a certain command. So in our script, we have to do the same thing. We have to tell the system that it is going to download. So here we're going to use a variable called FTP CMD, and we're going to use the RETR, which allows you to return, right, the file as. So that's how you will be able to download. So from the library, this has the functionality to be able to access that file. Okay. And then we are going to, again, use the client, and we're going to do an RETR binary, and we're going to execute the command, and we're going to use the file handler .write. Okay. So as you download, you have to be able to save it either in a temporary location or permanently. So you must, right, you must have it written. Then after that, we are going to issue the quit method. So we're going to quit for the client. Now, since we have it with the try exception, we're going to put in the exception part, how it's going to be able to handle error in the case that it cannot download. So we want to say file could not be downloaded, and it's going to show the error information. And the next part is going to be your main. So now in some of the other programs we see we don't have to put this, but Python interpreter, it still uses C, so you have to enter main. So we can say if namespace is main, we're going to call on the function that we define, FTP file download, and we're going to specify the server where it's going to access it from, which server, and it's going to be the login. So when you do a script like this, you want to specify your parameter with your username and password. So if I have a username and password, I need to include that here, right? But in the way that we define the function, we only define the server information and the user account. Since this is a publicly FTP site, right? It also allows anonymous, so we don't have to log in. We simply just use anonymous account. And so for the RETR binary, this allows you to download the file based on whatever the file name that you specify. And if you are interested in looking at other types of command, you can go to the RFC 959 to look at some type of commands that will be used. So in this one, we use the RETR command to be able to download the file. Okay. It's like clicking download and it would execute the command as an instruction on a lower level. Any question? Now, example 3 gives you a way to create a script to connect to the server and then move through different directory and download files. So unlike the previous one, example 3 have you change the directory to be able to download. Okay. So here we're going to import an FTP class from the module. We are going to have a function called write data, and we simply pass data as the parameter here. And we would use the file descriptor write from the module to be able to add the data. Now, very much like the last one or the second exercise that you see, you would have a client. So you have to create a client. Remember that the requirement is that you have to have a server, and second, you have to have at least one client. So here, how we can create client is we declared the name for it, and we would use the FTP instance, and we simply pass in the URL. Then we would tell it to log in. We would change the working directory to a certain location or a certain folder on that server. Then the next part, it's going to open up the file that we're asking it to download, which is changelog. Okay. And it's going to return the file and write the data. So this is another way that you can use to download your files from an FTP site. And then after that, we are going to have the file descriptor using the close method. So, and then we're going to quit the client, finish out. Any question? Yes, change the directory on the client. No, change the working directory. So you navigate to the directory on the server. So in the example 2, right? If you look back on example 2, This is the path that we set it, okay? So when you visit the site, you would likely get the welcome page, or that's where you land, right? That's your landing spot. So unless you specify what folder you need to be in. So in example 2, we have to implement which folder we need to access on the server in order to get this file. Now, a way that you can do that is to declare a variable and then set your path to that variable. So initialize that path for the variable and then be able to use that down here when you use the CDW, right? So ultimately, CDW takes you to the folder location on the server so you can download. In example 3, it is still using CDW, but instead of declaring it at earlier in the game, what we want is we want to, wherever we are, maybe we're on the landing page, right? Like the welcome page, the home page for the FTP server. We want it to change, to move into a different directory. So when you do a CDW, that just take you to a directory that would have that file on the server. Okay. And then after that, we open the file, then we write the data, we store the file, and then we close. Any question regarding download? Yes. It doesn't have the welcome banner. Plus, plus here on example 2, you're using a file handler. Not right? In example 3, you're still writing the file because you have to save it. Okay. So you're using a write data, which is slightly different than using a file handler. So with the file handler, it treats the file as an object, and then it writes that object to the client machine. Where here, when you do that, you accessing this file, right? You open up the file, and then you are going to take that file and write it to your storage on the client machine. Okay. Whereas the other one, you just use a file handler and be able to transfer the file. Other questions? So some of the functions in the FTP lib module here, you would see some of the functions, right? We can have the get welcome method is going to allow us to obtain a get welcome message. Okay. For the PWD, that will take you to the current directory, or your returns to your current directory. And then CWD, that's going to be your change of your working directory. So that's CWD is change of working directory. PWD is present working directory. So that's your existing where you are at. And if you need to move somewhere else, you would use the CDW and then its path, wherever that folder you need to go to. If you need to list the directories, you can use the dir. Endless gives you the file names of the directories. And then the size, that's going to return the size of your file, like in meg or kilobytes or bytes, etc. So with that, we can go and identify some of your functions. So for A, we want to return the list directory. We would use the dir method. For B, we want to return the current directory. So your present working directory, we would use a PWD or print working directory. So that will be your current directory that you are accessing now. And if you need to move into a different directory or change, you would do a CWD. If we need to list the file names of the directory, we would use the nlist. And nlist is different than dir in that dir lists the entire content of your PWD, whereas the nlist lists just the directories inside where you're currently located. So the list, the dir will give you like the files with it. And if we need to change your working directory, we simply just do a CWD. And you want to include the FTP in the front because these methods belong to the FTP class, right? So these are the member methods of that class. And when you bring in that class from the module, all you have to do is just to utilize the method is to include the instance. Any question? So fill out the appropriate method that is covered in the notes. You can select the appropriate one and place it next to your questions there. You can find this on page 2 and page 3 of our notes. And so here in example 4, you would see something similar. The objective behind this is to be able to go to a certain area and look at certain files or download certain files. So in example 4, we first have the import statement, very similar to what you've seen in the prior. We create the client, and inside the parameter, we want to put in the FTP site or the location. Then we want to print out the welcome message. And then we want to print out the client login. And we also want to list all the files and the folders. So we would do a dir. Now, this would take us back to the prior program, but what we can do is we can move into a certain folder by doing a CWD. And then we're going to use the nlist to list the content of kernel. And we're going to sort it. So Python has a built-in sort mechanism or sort method. So it's going to alphabetize that. And we want to print out the files from those folders. Since it's a group or a list, we need to use a for loop. So we can say for file in files, we're going to print the file. And when it's done, we can issue the quit. Okay. So in this example, what you're doing is you're moving from your current working directory into a certain area, very similar to the last one. But once you got your directory, you also want to look at the files. So you're using the nlist, and then you want to organize it by using the sort. Any question? Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, you would find that there's some brute force for each type of the server, FTP or SSH. And FTP lib module, it can be used to automate to create client and server systems. Any question regarding Any other prior example before we go look into the brute force? Now, as FTP sites sometimes, require credential, we can definitely brute force username and password to test the limitation of the site. In example 5, it's also used multiprocessing. And if you took advanced Python, you've seen this and worked with it before. So this program is designed to concurrently run so that way it will be quick. In our function, we define a brute force function, and its parameter is going to be the IP address, the username, and the password. Next, we would have an object called FTP, and we simply pass it the FTP lib. That will be the module, and then your class, FTP, and then the address. Any question? Then after that, we want to display the user account information. We also need to establish the login using username and password. So the response is going to come from the client system. Now, if you come across any kind of access granted information, so that will be your status code 230 for the response, you would then know that the access is granted. And we can print out, your successful brute force by plugging in the user account and the password information. In the L section, we simply just do a pass, as it doesn't have any body. Then we would handle the exception. Now in the main, there's a main method or main function. We would specify or ask the user to input an IP address. So in this one, you would prompt the user to put in an IP address. And we want to take that, we want to match it with the user.txt. So this file has to exist in order for the script to work. And it has to be placed in the same location as the script. And you can download user.txt via FuzzDB or other type of repository. Then it's gonna also go through and check the passwords. So it's gonna use password.x or .text, I'm sorry. And then that will be password. Now here, it's gonna read from the text. So it's gonna plug in. So this file has a list of passwords, and it's gonna read each line and it's gonna plug that in. And as it does that, we have to send it to a nested for loop for the user and the password. So you want it to be a combo with the user and the password, so you have to nest the loop. And then this is just gonna create concurrent program using multiprocessor. So you define an object called process, you use multiprocessing module, and you would have a process instance where it would look at the target and it's going to try to input the username and the target password. And then you have main is main, then you're going to call main. Any question? Okay. What if you want to make a scanner? So in the text, it gives you example on how to build scanner for anonymous login. So very similar to the last one, you also have a function here called anonymous login function. Then we're going to try. So we have to get this is the variable that's going to store the host name. Then we're going to issue the response. And so here is where you would bring in the user account and the password. Okay. And then we want to print that out, see what they plugged in. And then if this is granted in the response, it's going to look for the string. Okay. Then we know that we have a successful match. So that's how you would brute force is, how does it stop? We have to make sure that there's a condition that's applied to be able to force it to stop. So if it finds that this account is granted, then it's going to stop. Okay. And we print out the host name and the login for anonymous is succeeded. Okay. Any question? Then we want to show the welcome message. Okay. We want to list the subfolders and files and then handle the exception. Okay. So as you take a look at that, that's a brute force program or brute force script for FTP server, right? And it's simply try to plug in username and password. Now you will likely face the same issue with Paramigo, with, same as FTP-lib. If you install it for your Windows or via IDE, it might throw an error. So it will probably best to be able to test these with your Linux virtual machine or your Linux system. Okay, but typo on this. Oh yeah, it's pi. Okay. So in the next part, we're going to talk about SSH. As most of you had my classes before, you've seen that we can, or in other classes, you can use SSH to connect directly to a certain system. So for example, if I need to configure AWS virtual machines, I can connect to it if I know it's public information. So I can establish the physical communication along with, to be able to authenticate and access it, right? You can use that for the cloud. You can use system to, network appliance or system to security appliance using SSH. So SSH uses symmetric and asymmetric cryptography. And as it's using the key pair, you would be able to strive for confidentiality, authentication, and integrity in data transmission. So when you're using an asymmetric key, your keys are different, your public versus your private key. Public key can be published, and private key has to be kept by that private system. It also uses what's called the certification authority, the CA, to distribute keys or generate keys. And in order to generate keys in command line, like for Debian Linux, you would use SSH keygen. And some of you have done this on Raspberry Pi and other areas. So, okay, so after you generate the key is stored in a certain location, and this is a hidden file, .ssh known host. Then, in order for this to work on using a different tool, you can use OpenSSH. Okay. So OpenSSH or other type of SSH tool like PuTTY simply connects you to a certain server and then be able to allow you to download and so on without logging in. Then it's using anonymous. And you can install on Debian Linux OpenSSH server. So you just do apt-get install and then the server information, which is OpenSSH. Then to start, so if you install, that's not enough. We have to start, right? So we have to tell it to start the service. By in the command line, we would do a sudo service SSH. And then you can also check your status. So coming back to the question now, for number 4, the type of encryption supported by SSH would be symmetric and asymmetric encryption. And asymmetric uses key pair, public and private. Symmetric use the same key type in the pair, so you would have the same key to encrypt and decrypt. Often that you would see web-based services use the symmetric keys because it's faster. Now, we mentioned that your certification, I have a typo, authority is used to digitally sign your SSH key and distribute it to the requester. Okay. Certification authority, there's more to it than just that, but yeah, in this case, its job is to be able to generate and digitally assign keys. And then we talked about how to use command line to generate keys. So we would use the command ssh-keygen. As the keys are generated, it is stored in SSH known host. So later on, you would see that it would go there to really look to see if it has the file there. And once it does that, right, it will be able to allow the user to execute the next task, right, to connect, to be able to issue command and so on. So this is important, the known host file. So if I don't want to use SSH, I can use PuTTY, right? I can use other type of SSH application to be able to communicate with a certain server or system. Okay, you can use SSH to connect to, your switches, your routers, your security appliance, if they don't support any others except for, those areas. For number 8, what command do you use to open SSH package? You would use apt-get install SSH-server. And that allows you to install OpenSSH. To verify the status and to start the service, first you can start the service by using sudo service and then the SSH. For the second things that they ask for, we can say that we would use sudo service SSH status. So that's going to give us the status. Any question? So I can use OpenSSH. I just need to start the service and I can check on the service. Okay. And you can find that detail on your notes as well. So I'll point to that now. Okay, you can find it on the bottom of page 5, going to page 6. So SSH uses port 22 compared to FTP uses port 21. Now there are 2 versions of SSH. SSH1 is not secure, it has flaws. So it's been upgraded to version 2. So currently what we would see is we would see version 2 being applied, and that will be more safe than version 1. Now, Paramigo, in the networking class for Python, we talked about Paramigo and NetMiko, and it's used to connect the client to a certain system. Paramigo can also be used, in our case, this chapter is to establish client that will connect to a certain server that's SSH. Now, Paramigo rely on cryptography module or library or PyCrypto. Okay. Paramigo is used in automating things, but we can create script to automate server connections, to scan, to do different things. So you would see some of the example in following. But in order for Paramigo to work, keep in mind that you need cryptography because it needs to use cryptography for the keys, the public keys and the private keys that it talked about at the beginning. So we would use that for authentication. Now, SSH client can be made in Python, or you can simply use a third-party software like PuTTY or OpenSSH. Okay. So to install Paramigo, you would do pip3 install Paramigo. And with that, you need to install the cryptography module. Otherwise, it would not give you keys. Any question? So to connect using Paramigo, you simply do an import statement, import Paramigo. You just very similar to the FTP, right? You would have a client. You would create the client. And again, we would use this. Now we would use the SSH client instance to be able to create the client. Then we are going to connect. And here is where you would specify what is the host name, what's that system name, what is the username, and what is the password. Okay, so we would have to put in the actual password, the actual username, and so on. And if you don't have the file in the known host or the known host file in a certain location, it would not connect. Okay, so you would get a timeout or something like that. It will not be able to refer to the key. So if you don't have that, it will not work. So through it, we can actually parse and be able to identify the trust for certain keys. If you want to allow all trust for all keys, right, you can use this statement. So this is the client that you make, and you can set all the missing host key policy, and you would auto add that to the policy. Otherwise, it's going to block it. Okay. Then we can also restrict a certain type of host to be connected. So you can say, okay, this is the client. We're going to load a certain system with host keys. Now you can have the connection log in, right? So here, if you're using a Raspberry Pi, you would use the Raspberry Pi name, or if you use a Linux machine, you would put that in. Often you would see localhost and then username and password. Okay, any question? So let's take it back to the assignment here. So for number 10, we can say that to use Paramigo, we would need to install cryptography or PyCrypto modules, right? Because it needs that to be able to generate the keys. And when we looked at that, we would say that to restrict specific host connection, we can use load system host keys method. Any questions? See a chat. For example, it asks for the password to unlock the private key. Okay, let me look at that again. Yeah, so here, when you look at the try section, okay, you create a client to start. So here we set up the client for the common debug information. We would generate, we add it to the policy. Otherwise, it's going to block it. We connect host port, username, and password. Yes. So in order to generate any key, the certification authority would require that you have a credential. And if you don't log in successfully, it would not generate any key. And so even when we add this, right, because once you do that, it would then, so I would be able to log in after this for the response, and then it would set up the connection here. Yeah, you would have, it would generate the key subsequent to your login. Mm-hmm. Because it would not, just like how you think of it, like when you're trying to use Raspberry Pi and you're trying to connect your Raspberry Pi to another system using SSH, you have to successfully authenticate to that Pi. If I did not set up a private key yet, I would not get this pop-up. No. Well, depends though. If you're using symmetric key, you only need to generate public keys. Okay. But if you're using RSA, which is a PKI infrastructure, right? PKI, then you have to generate a private key. Yeah, so it requires the credential to set up the cryptography. Any questions? So this is how you would use Paramigo to be able to establish connection, SSH. And then alternately, there's like the NetMiko for setup as well. Okay. Now, if you want to run commands, you can also run command using exec command or executing command, right, in Paramigo. So when we connect to the system, we want to be able to use it. So the way that we would use it is to give it a command, right? Like what you've seen in FTP earlier, like, you know, the command will be retrieve some kind of files. So that will be like a download action. So we can set it up to be able to run a certain command. Okay. Here it uses the get pass and Paramigo library. Then when you look, we're simply connecting to the local host using port 22. So you would specify that here in your function. Then the first thing, right, in order to connect, we have to have a client. We can set that to accept the key, because when you do an auto add policy, that just add it to the rule so it accepts the key. Then it's gonna load the system host key, so that way we can also restrict specific keys to the trust. And we would use the client connect method to be able to connect using the specified username, hostname, port, and password. And then subsequently, we would then print and then close. And then after that, we would have a for loop. It's going to read, right? As you can see that it's going to print from the prior here. So it's going to do a read and then split the line and then decode the line. Then in the main, we simply set up our username, hostname, password, command that we want. And then we just call the function name and pass those parameters. Now, doing this is different than example 10, because example 10 talks about using a different method, which is transport, in order to connect. So if your objective is to connect to an SSH server, then you can use either one. But it's still coming out of the Paramigo library. So for transport, though, you can include IP address, right, to connect, and the type of object that you want for authentication, like username and password. So very similar to the other one. But if you recall in the previous example here, you would see that it's using SSH client to set up the client, and it would mainly use the client class. Now, earlier we saw that we could brute force the FTP. You can also write script to brute force with Paramigo. Okay, and notice in example 11, it uses Paramigo socket and also time. So we simply just write a function to brute force. And here we would have host name, port, user, and password. Then we would create an object called log, and that's going to generate a log file. We then create a client. Okay. Then we generate the keys and then add those keys to the rules or the policy. Then we will be able to print that out. And then as we do that, we will call the methods or the function. Then in main, we specify those variables, hostname, port, users, and so on. And we would have a loop to be able to put in the password, right? So we brute forcing. Now, the text file, it's going to read from the user and the password files, and it's going to plug that in. Okay. So the way that we approach brute force in scripting is that we just set up a text file, or you can go and find tons of different downloads, making sure that it's together with your script, meaning storing in the same folder. And so when you use it, it's going to look for this, right? It's going to open the password, read, and then read a line, and then plug it into the field for the password, along with looking at the user account and the appropriate, and then it's going to plug the account into the field information on the FTP server. Okay. So we have answered number 11 for the instance SSH client. You can use that with Paramiko to restrict certain hosts, to create client, to do a lot of things. And that will be similar to what you see with transport. Okay. And as the way that they wrote that class is, it operates very similar to what you would see in the back, where it would connect and establish a TCP connection through the port 22. Okay. Now, what if I'm using secure FTP? I can use the Pi SFTP module to establish the SSH connection. So the majority of the FTP site that you've seen are going to be SFTP, okay, compared to FTP, and it uses port 22 as well. So when you're using Pi SFTP, it is a wrapper around Paramiko. So the functionality is very similar to Paramiko, but it is a wrapper. So it has some added abstraction functionality. So here it tells you that it provides abstraction by encapsulating higher function use case of interacting with SSH to list and transfer file. So you still be able to identify directories and files for the FTP server that's secure, because the basic functionality is still the same as Paramiko module. It's just there's some added encapsulation. And the way that you install Pi SFTP is you would use, right? You can use Python 3. Here we can make this Python 3 -m pip, or you can simply also use pip3 install Pi SFTP. And again, these work really well with Linux machines. So sometime because if it is a library that uses C compiler, it does not install well through regular command prompt. So you would have to set that up through like Visual Studio, and then, the majority of the stuff uses C. So you just gotta make sure that, and it works seamlessly with your Linux system, Debian Linux, that is, right? Okay. So before we answer the next couple of questions, we can take a look at our notes. Okay. So example 12 shows you how you can use Pi SFTP. So unlike, your FTP lib, we would import in Pi SFTP, and we would also use get pass, because SFTP uses SSH. So you have to incorporate the authentication component. We declare a variable that's going to be our host name, our port number, and then we define a function. In this function, it's going to establish the connection with authentication. So we want to have username, password, host, and then port. And we have a with statement. So we would use connection instance to be able to connect to our host. And your parameter here is just the components or the elements that you need to connect to authenticate and identify the host name, then authenticate, right? Then we would use CDW, so change working directory. So that's going to take us back to our root. And then we're going to use list directory. And this is going to look at your directory attributes. And it's going to give you the file name and the directory. And then in the main, after we declare all the variable that holds, So here, if you notice, right, you prompt the user to enter your host name, right, enter the port, enter the username, enter the password. And so it's going to take that, it's going to plug it in when it creates a connection between the client and the secure FTP server. Any question? Okay, so now this one, you don't have to import Paramigo, right? Because it is a wrapper of Paramigo, so it has similar functionality. Then next, we're going to talk about async SSH. So I think at the beginning, we mentioned briefly about async IO. If you took 30E, CIS30E, you work with async IO. So there's a module called async SSH. This allows you to implement servers and client that works with SSH version 2. And it works over async IO module. So since it's SSH, we have to use encryption. So you will be required to install cryptography module when you're using this. And in order to install async SSH, you simply do a pip3 install async SSH or a Python 3-m by pip install. Example 13 shows you how you can connect to the server and then use a certain command for that server. So here we would use async SSH, async IO, and then a get pass import. Okay. Because it is a wrapper, you are going to put async in front of your function definition. Notice that? Okay. So you would have async, and then you would do your function name, like what you've seen before, right? And its parameter or arguments. Then after that, we would write the with statement. So because we're using that, so we have to make sure that async is there. And this is where we would specify for the connection. And we are going to have it run the command. Okay. In the main, we would set up for the variables to have the user input. And then for the password, that's going to pull in from what the user entered. And then we're going to loop using async IO. And then we're going to output and execute the print. So as it executes the command, right, you notice right here, Okay, so as it does that, it's going to execute the command. And the key file, it's going to put it in SSH host, this location. Okay. So a little bit different than that last one. When you're using async SSH, you have to also use async IO, and then the way that you define the function and its body, because you're using async, so you have to include that as it is well. Okay, so let's answer the next couple of questions. For 14, async SSH, the use of that in SSH client or server implementation, you have to make sure that it works on top of async IO to implement client or server. So when you create a client, right, you're going to bring in async SSH and async IO, and they work together to give you your connection, your command run, to run your command at a certain place, and also for authentication to automate that. Okay, we're almost done. Just a few more minutes. Okay, so the last part of the chapter, it touches on auditing, right? Checking on the security of your SSH server. Is it secure? What kind of configuration is it lacking, and so on. So when you're doing an audit of a system, basically you're assessing, right, its configuration for the security. Okay. So there's a tool which is called ssh-audit. It is a Python script that will give you the details about your SSH configuration, like looking at login banner, checking key exchange algorithm, looking at public key and authenticated related information. If you have Debian Linux, you can do apt install, sudo apt install ssh-audit, and it will bring in the tool. Okay. You can also use other external tool like Rebex, and this allows you to check, very similar to the last one, your key exchange, and also because it's key related, it will also look at your PKI algorithm and your MAC algorithms. Okay, you can find the link for that here. So to answer the last question, we can say that for the Debian Linux OS, we can use SSH-audit tool. We just have to install it. And that will give us information about our SSH server configuration. Okay. Now, because it's widely used in a network environment for administration purposes, for connectivity, for a lot of things, it would be worthwhile to do periodic audit, right? If not regular audit, depending on how much you use or how often you use. Any question? Okay, so chapter is not too long. If you have the textbook, you can look through it. I try to include almost all the example, but there might be a couple that I might have left out. So you can also look at the source code that's provided by the publishing company. You can test those, okay? Best to test on Linux machine. So for the lab this week, we will use Linux virtual machine, as you can see that sometimes some of these libraries cannot be installed on a Windows system. Any question? Okay. Let me stop the recording.